Americans have long viewed marriage between a white man and a white woman as a sacred union. But marriages between African Americans, Tera W. Hunter shows, have seldom been treated with the same reverence. This discriminatory treatment is the legacy of centuries of slavery, when the overwhelming majority of black married couples were bound in servitude as well as wedlock. Recognition of African Americans' right to marry on terms equal to white couples would remain a struggle into the Jim Crow era and resonate well into the 20th century. Here, Hunter discusses the lack of legal protection of the intimate relationships of black people in the antebellum United States. Bound in Wedlock: Slave and Free Black Marriage in the 19th Century. The status of the African in Georgia, whether bound or free, is such that he has no civil, social, or political rights or capacity whatever except such as are bestowed on him by statute, wrote Joseph Henry Lumpkin, the slaveholding Chief Supreme Court Justice of the state, in 1853. He argued that the act of manumission confers no other right but that of freedom from the dominion of the master and the limited liberty of locomotion. Manumitted slaves did not have masters, but they did need white guardians to protect their interests and watch over them. They were expected to live in a state of perpetual pupilage or wardship, which they could not escape of their own volition, he wrote. In reality, even their liberty of locomotion was of a limited kind, encumbered as it was by a state increasingly restricting where black people could live upon emancipation in the antebellum decades. Justice Lumpkin's sweeping opinion went well beyond the conventional boundaries of a case adjudicating the property rights of free blacks. He argued that to become a citizen of the body politic capable of contracting, of marrying, of voting, requires something more than the mere act of enfranchisement. Free blacks should never expect to be the peer and equal of the white man, he opined. The free black resides among us and yet is a stranger, a native even, and yet not a citizen. Lumpkin's opinion could not be more clear about the lack of legal protection for the intimate relationships of blacks, regardless of their status as slave or free. Slaveholding states provided free African Americans few of the positive rights in the statutes he identified. The right to marriage was not guaranteed. Lumpkin's sweeping condemnation reflected what free blacks were up against in slave societies in the South and even societies in the North where the number of slaves was dwindling. Georgia was one of the states most hostile to the rights of free blacks, but Lumpkin's views were neither extreme nor singular. His words anticipated the Dred Scott decision, and his sentiments were widely shared by like-minded peers in positions of power. In the first half of the 19th century, freedom and slavery were not polar opposites for African Americans, but points along a continuum. The protracted process of emancipation in the North and the uneven process of individual and episodic manumission in the mostly Upper South meant that many African American families were part slave and part free for years and even decades on end. Free African Americans encountered an avalanche of restrictive legislation, psychological assaults, and physical threats and violations that diminished their status in the antebellum era. Mixed status marriages, unions between slaves and free blacks, were treated no better than slave marriages and sometimes even worse, since some states expressly forbade them by statute. As the South increased its commitment to slavery, white elites minimized the distance between slavery and freedom by dividing society into two distinct groups: enslaved black people and white free people. Free blacks were increasingly forced to take extreme measures that were incongruent with their presumed status in order to protect their most viable assets, their marriages and families. They understood their ability to form intimate ties as essential to their individual and group survival, and, as we will see, they sometimes were forced to sacrifice their freedom to sustain them. Black couples were the least privileged and most fragile among the free married people in their communities, and yet surprisingly, little has been written about their relationships, despite attention to nearly every other aspect of their experiences, including political activism, labor, property ownership, housing, education, and religion. Interracial relationships rather than relationships between Blacks have attracted the historical spotlight. The family matters of free people of color are most visible in the historical records and legal proceedings, some of which they initiated themselves, and others that targeted them for various infractions that threatened both their status as free people and their relationships. Even as their rights became even more limited and increasing numbers of free people were denied citizenship, they used the legal system, especially in their local communities, through petitions to counties and state legislatures, and civil and criminal court cases, including divorce proceedings. Extant documents not only tell us about their official status, but also allows us to peer into their intimate affairs. They offer a rich repository of narratives about the daily domestic lives of a diverse group of free people of color. Together, their stories illustrate the range of experiences and challenges they faced. Most strikingly, they reveal that freedom, at best, was a process, not an achievement that could be taken for granted. The mere act of enfranchisement did not guarantee marital or any other rights. The process of emancipation had been protracted in the northern states, and manumission of individuals in the border states, begun following the American Revolution, was still underway after 1800. Many blacks remained caught somewhere between slavery and freedom. The end of slavery in the North was propelled more by atrophy of the slave population through mortality, low fertility, runaways, and the decline of the Atlantic slave trade than by efforts of abolitionists. Vermont was the first state to outlaw slavery in its constitution in 1777, but the ban applied only to men over 21 and women over 18, not to children. All other states passed variations on legislation that promised freedom to children born of slave women after a certain date and then prescribed indentureships for them. In effect, this meant that adult slaves would, by law, live out their natural lives in the same condition, and their unborn children would suffer the fate of involuntary servitude to their mothers, masters, until they reached the prescribed age of maturity, later for men than for women. In all cases, the initial laws and constitutional provisions were ineffective enough to require the passage of subsequent legislation that took decades to complete. Northern states, with the most slaves, were the most resistant to laws prescribing enslavement, such as New York and New Jersey. New York began a gradual program in 1799 and then ended slavery completely in 1827. New Jersey began its gradual plan in 1804. The number of slaves declined there significantly by the 1840s, but a few slaves still remained in the state when the Civil War began. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in December 1865, freed the rest. The gradual emancipation plans implemented in northern states were particularly difficult for the offspring of slaves, who were remanded to indentured servitude until well into adulthood. Masters, not parents, retained final authority over the children of slaves. They were birthed into a system that crippled their ability to advance economically or socially. Masters had few obligations to teach black children skills or educate them, as they had done with white servants. Thus, there were few distinctions between being a slave for life or a servant for a term. Indentured servants were especially vulnerable to abuses in the system, even to the real threat of being sold to the South. Some slaves were able to negotiate to end their indentureships before their terms expired, and others ran away. Manumission could also come with strings attached, forcing those who violated agreements with former masters back into bondage. The arrival of refugees from the Haitian Revolution, foreign slave owners with slaves in tow, also boosted indentured servitude in places like Philadelphia, where the judicial system upheld the right of masters to subject their slaves to terms of servitude. The situation was worse in New York, where the law permitted masters to prolong their authority over formerly enslaved chattel through indentures as late as 1848. Ironically, some abolitionists inadvertently prolonged indentured servitude in the North in their attempts to rescue Southern slaves and place them in positions of term service rather than outright freedom. Marriage was typically illegal for indentured servants, and when it was allowed, the permission of the master was required, just as in slave marriages. These restrictions negatively affected the family lives of free blacks in communities where they served terms until late in their 20s, pushing their marriages much later in their life cycles than was the case for whites. Most free blacks lived in the South. Their numbers grew in the Upper South following the Revolution as changes in the economies allowed masters to sell off excess slaves or let them purchase their freedom. But the window that had opened at the turn of the 19th century quickly closed by 1820, as slave owners feared that the growing number of free blacks were a threat to slavery. After 1820, masters tended to manumit only their most privileged slaves, especially their mulatto offspring, on an individual basis. The number of free blacks in the Lower South stagnated and then declined. Typically, only the most elite slaves were able to purchase their freedom or gain access to it as a stipulation included in their masters' wills. Yet, despite the limits imposed on free blacks in the South, they were better off economically than their counterparts in the North because they faced less competition for certain skilled jobs. Nonetheless, their physical and social mobility was far more limited by the constant fear that their color made them vulnerable to re-enslavement. Free blacks were increasingly perceived as a menace to Southern slave society as it became more reliant on bound labor. The absolute subjection of people of color, no matter their status, became an imperative because freedom contradicted the rationale for the enslavement of blacks, and ties between the enslaved and the free made it difficult to distinguish one from the other. As one group of whites in Virginia wrote in a petition to the state legislature in 1831, standing thus in a middle position between the two extremes of our society, and despairing of ever attaining an equality with the higher grade, it is natural that they should connect themselves in feeling and interest with the slaves among whom many of their domestic ties are formed, and to whom they are bound by the sympathies scarcely less strong, which spring from their common complexion. Southern states passed laws over the course of the antebellum era, making it harder for blacks to gain and retain any meaningful free status. Many states forced manumitted slaves to leave or prevented free people of color from migrating there. In 1806, Virginia was one of the first states to force manumitted slaves to leave the state within 1 year of their freedom. Mississippi lumped all African Americans together, slaves, free Negroes, and mulattoes, in one consolidated law in 1822 that contained 86 parts. Among the requirements of the law, free people were forced to pay security of $500 to keep the peace and ensure their good behavior. If they failed to pay the security or violated its terms, they could face jail or be sold into slavery to the highest bidder. The state passed more laws in 1845 that were part of a restrictive campaign referred to as the Inquisition, as violators were rounded up and deported from the state. Manumissions by last wills were outlawed. Georgia required all free people of color to pay an annual tax of $5 starting in 1851. Within a few years, it permitted those who could not afford to pay to be fined or hired out. Those who were considered idle, immoral, profligate, or were caught strolling about, could be convicted for vagrancy, with the severe punishment of sale into slavery for 2 years for the first offense and permanently after the third offense. The process of manumitting slaves individually in the South significantly disadvantaged blacks when choosing marriage partners. The uneven achievement of freedom meant that many blacks found themselves related to or married to unfree people. These mixed status marriages were part of a larger pattern of irregular marriages in European colonies in the Americas among slaves, quasi-free people, and poor populations across the color line. Formal marriage was initially a privilege that people in the mostly white upper echelons could attain, though it was becoming more accessible within the lower ranks, at least in the North in the 18th century. Mixed status marriages were common throughout slave societies, although their legal status and white society's level of tolerance toward them changed over time. In the colonial period, mixed status interracial marriages had some legal standing in the North and even in some places in the South, though in all cases the unions fell short of inviolability because masters could interfere at any time. At first, states tolerated such couples in some places like Virginia, allowing them to register their unions legally and legitimize their children. By the end of the 18th century, however, legislatures began to pass laws restricting slaves and free blacks from socializing. Eventually, they increased the constraints prohibiting marriage without a master's consent, or in some places outlawing it altogether. In North Carolina, if the master of the enslaved granted permission to marry, couples could expect to pay him a fee. Louisiana, which outlawed mixed status marriages, punished the slave owner and the free spouse when the law was violated. But it also allowed an unusual exemption. Free men of color could marry their own slave women if they had no legitimate wives, according to the forms prescribed by the church. Sacramental ceremonies officiated by Catholic priests. Their wives would then be declared free and their children legitimate. This practice ended, however, after the Louisiana Purchase and the implementation of American civil laws in the state in 1808. This was consistent with the general antebellum trend toward more policing and prohibitions of mixed status coupling. Mississippi, for example, included restrictions in its 1822 omnibus law, but they were designed to give masters optimal control over enslaved women by empowering owners to sue free black men who took their property away. Regardless of statutory laws, mixed status relationships could hardly be avoided or eliminated. States struggled to enforce the laws and prosecute violations, which meant that many couples found ways of evading the laws or disobeying them with impunity. There is no way to estimate how many mixed status couples existed or what proportion of black marriages they constituted at any given time. There is substantial evidence of the presence of such marriages everywhere, however. Because women were manumitted more often than men, they made up a greater percentage of free black populations and were forced to seek spouses outside their cohort, including among the enslaved. Mixed marriages, in general, were the product of several converging forces. Slaves and free blacks lived, worked, and played in close proximity to one another, forming various kinds of allegiances on the basis of blood and social connections. The staggered nature of manumission meant that though some couples began their marriages while both were slaves, at some point one spouse became free and the other either followed at a later date or was never manumitted. Slaves able to hire themselves out and live independent of their masters were most likely to be in positions to marry or engage in intimate arrangements with free blacks. Many of them were thus able to share the same households, though some, as was the case with enslaved couples, lived abroad. Still, others lived full-time in the household of the master of the enslaved spouse. In some cases, in order to get masters to agree to such an arrangement, the free person became an indentured servant for a time, sacrificing their own freedom and risking subordination beyond the agreed-upon terms. These deals could be attractive because they sometimes entailed the freedom of the enslaved spouse at the end of the specified term. This was especially crucial for the slave women as prospective mothers, as it meant their children would be free at birth. These couples remained at the mercy of the master of the enslaved spouse. A decision to move slaves into the master's household or to sell them off could create havoc. Theoretically, at least, the free person could potentially move or follow behind a beloved one if they were to be separated. Doing so, however, meant incurring the financial costs of relocating and potentially violating laws that impeded free people's migration across state lines. Laws forcing migration on manumitted slaves sometimes meant that the free spouse was the one to leave the state. Returning legally to visit or to reclaim kin left behind required dispensation from legislatures, which was not often granted. Mixed status couples had big incentives to free their enslaved loved ones, given their divided family status. They depended on masters, legal guardians, and surrogates to keep their word when they made arrangements to buy out kin. Slaves in positions of relative privilege often worked overtime to earn enough money to buy their own freedom. Once the agreed upon sums were accumulated and paid, they might assume that the deal was complete, but it was not necessarily legally binding. Most slaves could not read or write, furthering their disadvantage and dependence on the goodwill of outsiders. Southern laws that required former slaves to leave their homes upon manumission meant that freedom could come with a price. Any hope of staying in place often meant raising extra money as security to be paid for their good behavior, and also special commendation from state legislatures granting them exemptions from forced exile laws. One former slave, for example, petitioned the Tennessee legislature in desperation after being told that he was not legally free, despite the deal he had made and fulfilled with his former master. He was concerned about his own status, but even more worried about his wife and child, as his sponsors explained, as dear as liberty is to him, and galling as are the chains of bondage, we would prefer remaining a slave. That is, if he could not be free and keep his family intact, along with his land, freedom did not amount to much. With the assistance of many white friends who vouched for his character, industry, and honesty, the state legislature granted him a reprieve. Many slaves tried to purchase themselves and other family members to protect their interests. The birth of a new child might spark the desire to emancipate family members, especially if the mother was a slave. When one spouse was free and the other a slave, they worried about the fate of the enslaved spouse upon the death of the freed person. Buying family members and holding on to them as nominal slaves could be a strategy for protecting them, but it could backfire if the free spouse died first, leaving the enslaved spouse in abeyance or at the mercy of executors. As couples advanced in age, freedom became more imperative. One elderly free person argued that he feared the tyrannic grasp and relentless cupidity of some unfeeling wretch to be deprived of that portion of liberty which the sweat of his humble brow has purchased for them. Unfortunately, not all free people were able to get their fiscal affairs in order before they died, even if they may have been in the process of trying to do so. Drawing up wills could be protracted affairs for free people reliant on others to carry out their wishes for their estates, putting enslaved family members at risk while the details were worked out. If they died intestate, their enslaved loved ones had to rely on the good graces of white guardians to carry out their wishes and do right in freeing their wives and children. Free spouses might also deliberately choose not to free their enslaved spouses whom they nominally owned before they died to avoid automatic ejection from the state, instead devising other creative maneuvers to safeguard them. One husband thought his enslaved wife was better off if he left her property in his will, which he presumed would in itself make her free. Sometimes these arrangements were made in consultation with lawyers who helped free blacks find loopholes within tenuous laws. Such risks paid off for some, though by no means all. Enslaved men with sufficiently accumulated resources for self-purchase sometimes preferred to free their wives even before freeing themselves. One couple had endured years, if not decades, in an abroad marriage living at a considerable distance of 25 to 30 miles, but despite their years together, they still felt their relationship was not secure from a separation that would make it harder to care for each other as they grew older. The desire to emancipate one to make it easier for the couple to live in closer proximity was further complicated by forced migration laws for manumitted slaves, however. The slave man was required to get a white guardian to go before the legislature of his state to seek a special exemption that would allow him to purchase his wife and also allow her to stay in the state. The absence of such a guarantee would defeat the entire purpose of her emancipation. Couples in mixed status marriages could feel especially vulnerable when they had property owned by either spouse or both. Imagine this predicament for slave men married to free women. They were helpless and dependent, beholden to women who would otherwise be their subordinates if not for their own enslaved status. Whatever property a slave man owned, he could not legally claim, but he could vest it in his wife. A slave man in North Carolina petitioned the legislature, through a guardian, with care and trepidation, for his freedom. The couple had accumulated significant wealth, which consisted of land, livestock, cash, and even slaves, none of which a slave could legally claim. His wife had purchased him from the executor of his master's estate, but the transaction appeared to be incomplete. He was in limbo, which put him at the mercy of his wife. He acknowledged that he was concerned that either her death or change of heart could wipe out his share of their treasure. He had no reason to believe the latter would happen, but he clearly did not want to see his hard work wiped away under either circumstance. Unfortunately for him, the legislature did not agree to pass an act on his behalf. Some free people tried to prevent the problems that mixed status couples faced by removing their beloved from the grips of slavery even before they married. A free man in Virginia decided such a plan when he became fascinated by a lovely female of his own color who happened to be a slave. They agreed, however, that she should be emancipated so that they could marry legally. He had to borrow money to make the purchase and entrust a white guardian for help. He succeeded in buying her on an installment plan, and they began to build their family, welcoming 2 children within a short time. But they had to face another bind. The laws of the state required his wife to leave upon being granted her freedom. Even as the husband continued to pay off the debt of purchasing his wife, he pleaded with the legislature to allow them to remain in the state and keep their freedom, which it refused to do. Legislatures were not always amendable, even in the wishes of slave owners. In some cases, masters were willing not only to permit mixed status couples to wed, but also to do everything in their own power to protect them from the caprice that could threaten or dissolve their union. This required extra vigilance, expert legal counsel in estate planning, and faith that their heirs and executors would follow through with their wishes post mortem. Slaves as valued property were frequently entwined in legal cases that could drag on for years as the estates of descendants were settled, partially or entirely on the basis of redistributing, exchanging, or selling bound labor in ways that broke up black families, leaving the free spouses unable to do much, if anything, to intervene. Masters using the greatest forethought tried to avoid these predicaments, but they were also limited by laws designed to prevent them from having unfettered reign over the disposal of assets without due consideration of other fiduciary or social stakeholders. Others died intestate, with all the best intentions never being formalized in their wills, leaving mixed status families stranded. A slave owner could give a plot of land to a special slave and her free husband and allow the slave to hire out her time to him, eventually allowing them to live as quasi-free. But in the absence of a will, others could easily question the legitimacy of those decisions and accuse the deceased of breaking rules against illegal trusts or skirting the laws that prevented masters from manumitting their slaves without legislative approval. The gender configurations of mixed status coupling could make a difference in how spouses were considered by slave owners. Free men married to enslaved women were often looked on favorably by masters of the women, as the addition of the man's labor and economic contributions could be financially beneficial. But free men could also raise competing interests between the rights of husbands and the rights of slave owners, a conflict over coverture. The rights of husbands to have unencumbered dominion over their wives and children were considered so foundational that they could not be easily reconciled in the face of challenges of property rights. Even in jurisdictions that tried to make clear that recognition of marital rights of people in bondage did not contravene the preeminence of property rights, mixed status couples' ambiguous status could call these into question. But there was no such right safe from revocation even in the North or border states, where legal marriage was sometimes protected. Free men who had slaves as wives faced further complications, especially if they tried to purchase their freedom. In the process of obtaining ownership of a spouse, did the slave become a wife, or was she merely the property of a man who could not be her legal husband? The perverse contradiction of the laws of slavery and freedom is exposed in a scenario in Kentucky. The laws in that state made it clear that African Americans could not participate in the slave trade for commercial purposes. They were allowed to purchase only certain slaves who were relatives for the purpose of protecting them and keeping families from being split apart. This was further buttressed by the fact that a master's consent to sell his slave woman, effectively giving her, for a fee, to a man to be her husband, sealed the objective of solidifying marriage. And yet creditors were legally entitled to challenge these very facts when they inconveniently disrupted their own fiduciary interests in the marketability of slaves. They could assert their superior rights to make claims on slave property regardless of the relationship between chattel and owner. Creditors could claim that a free man's purchase of his wife was a pretended sale, designed to exempt his property, wife or no wife, from execution for the purpose of paying his debts. A free black man could purchase a slave wife only for the purposes of rescuing her from the normal rules of the slave market, and yet the same slave was legally liable to being subjected to creditors demanding that she be sold off to pay her husband's debts. Free black men had few enforceable legal rights that white men were bound to respect. Free women who married slave men, by contrast, were in the unique position of being considered heads of household because their husbands had no legal standing. In one sense, they were regarded as femmes seules, single women who had legal rights that women customarily relinquished when they married. They had to play out reverse gender roles and perform the duties as providers and protectors of hearth and home that their enslaved husbands could not. But in other respects, they were treated as inferior forms of femme covert, married women who were more like dependent children or slaves in the eyes of the law. A case from Massachusetts illustrates these dilemmas. Whatever concessions northern states made with one hand to support slave and mixed status marriages, they took away with the other. Harriet, a pauper in the state of Maine in 1820, and the mother of an infant, was the subject of a battle between two towns, neither of which wanted to be deemed her official place of settlement and thus responsible for her care. The determination rested in large part on whether her grandfather Isaac Hazard Stockbridge, a slave, and her grandmother Cooper Loring, his free wife, had a legal marriage. Hazard, as he was called in the documents, died in the colony of Massachusetts in 1780, before Maine became a separate state and before his granddaughter Harriet was born. Harriet's mother, Lucy, was 11 years old when he died. The plaintiff in the case, the town of Hollowell, argued that Hazard was effectively abandoned by his master and thus was emancipated, which established his residence and that of his family in the town of Pittston. later incorporated into Gardenier, where he and his family had last lived. Thus the marriage to Cooper Loring was legal, but if he was still a slave, then his marriage was void and his wife's settlement would have been assigned to the other town. If the marriage was legal and Hazard was still a slave, then neither he nor his wife could be legal residents. In short, Hallowell argued that no matter what his condition or the legality of their marriage, Hazard did not belong as a resident there, and thus neither did his wife nor children and grandchildren. The defendant in the case, the town of Gardenier, argued that his master did not emancipate Hazard, but regardless of his status, slaves had the right to marry under the laws of Massachusetts colony since 1707. As a slave, he could not establish a settlement of his own for himself or his family, nor could his wife, a free woman, establish residency because to give her such recognition would violate the norms of marriage by treating husband and wife as separate entities rather than as one. If the wife was allowed to establish residency on her own, her children could not unless they were illegitimate. So if the marriage was legal, the children were legitimate and their settlement rested with their father, who was a slave without rights. Like Hallowell, Gardenier tried to pass along responsibility for taking care of the family at the center of the case. It worried about the limited services that Harriet, a femme covert with an infant, could render and the taxes that she could not afford to pay. The plaintiff's rebuttal summed up how the logic of the argument on both sides left Harriet in a bind. She has no settlement by the father, he being a slave, none by the mother, she being lawfully married, and none in her own right, and yet she is a native of the state. The judge ruled that Hazard was indeed a slave, not manumitted by his master, and that the slave marriage was valid, though in the same way that minors had the right to marry. He also ruled that Hazard's wife, Cooper Loring, could not obtain a separate settlement from her husband, as the defense had argued it would contravene the relationship of the couple. In effect, the wife's rights to establish residency was overruled by the determination to protect the mixed-status couple's abstract marriage, albeit not one that accrued all the civil rights of fully endowed adults. Thus, she could not be a resident of Gardenier. Neither could Lucy, the daughter of the couple, as a child, 10 years old at the time the town of Pittston was incorporated by Gardenier. Legal marriage came to naught for Hazard, who suffered the disadvantages of being a slave, and Loring, who suffered the disadvantages of being a free woman of color married to a slave man. The plaintiffs lost, Harriet lost more.